What is that box you got open up there? The main box.
Yeah, this is my PowerPoint presentation. Hi, everybody. Oh man, the crew's here. What's up, Nagy family? All right. It's going to be a party. Stephanie Deathelm, who's in there right now, doing our atrium level 3. What a blessing to have her. She, I believe, was in charge at All Saints of the atrium for years and years. And now she brought atrium to Alabama. And so she's responsible for like having trained all of us and all the churches, and now it's expanded across. And now, if you don't have atrium, you're really frowned upon in the Episcopal community. So what a great servant of the Lord to bring public shame back to the church. You know, I love it. Friends, we are talking about the Exodus. Did you all go home and read the story of the Exodus? Did you read like chapter 1 of the Exodus? Okay. Y'all get out your family Bibles. Don't worry. You read through chapter 5. Good. Don't worry. We're going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb today and through the rest of the month. We're only going to have one little blurb where on the 13th, February 13th, we're going to have Audrey Moore will come and do a Bible study on her work with Lift Up the Vulnerable. And so I encourage you to come for that. It'll be wonderful. That's with like refugees in South Sudan, the work, the ministries they have. So exciting. Exodus. Now, Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. There's about 300 years from Joseph. Now look, this is squishy math. Like, don't pull out your timetables. There's a whole like branch of Christianity to try to like map out timelines and have everything pinpoint. It is squishy math. It is about 300 years from Joseph and people coming down out of Canaan into Egypt and Moses. So it's not right away, it's several generations. 300 years ago, what was happening in America? I was listening to a comedian who I really like. He was talking, he said his father was 70 years old when he was born. He said his grandfather, that's it. His grandfather, so his father was at 70 when he was born. His grandfather was born in the 1880s. It's like, that's something. Like, that's something else, right? That's 140 years ago. That's only half the time. So we got to keep in mind kind of the squishy math, and we're going to talk about the historicity. That's the right word. They all died. They were all gone. His family was exceedingly fruitful, and a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. There's a great line out of history that the Romans had thought this would be a wonderful idea. We're going to give everyone who's a slave a special cape. So then like we'll know who's slave and who's like, not slave and who's free. And we understand kind of the rank of society. So before they pulled the trigger on it, before they went and caped everyone, they stopped and said, no, wait, if all the slaves realize how many they are, we're going to be in great danger. If they realize how far exceedingly they outnumber us, like that's going to spell bad news for the slave owners. And Pharaoh is having this crisis of faith. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So they built these two towns, Pithom and Ramses. Ramses, presumably named after Pharaoh Ramses. We think this is Ramses II. Now we actually know a lot about Ramses II, and we know a lot about Ramses III because they love to build stuff celebrating their glory. They loved having big old, sarcophaguses. They were buried in the Valley of the Kings out in the desert where they hollowed out sandstone and they built these elaborate mausoleums for themselves. And then we discovered it. It was great. So we know an abundance about Ramses II. He's exceedingly famous. And some would say he was kind of the biggest king in Egypt. From old Egypt to Middle Egypt to New Egypt, he was like the king of kings, where he was able to unite a lot of kingdoms, where he was able to stretch all the way north through Canaan into like the Hittite kingdom, which would go up into Turkey, kind of back into Greece, and all the way down into the Nubian kingdom, which would be, I guess, South Sudan, on down to Ethiopia. So massive kingdom. And man, they like to write about his own victories. They worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. The setting described in Exodus could be Egypt's East Delta. So it starts up in the mountains. The Nile River starts up in the mountains. There's only a couple rivers in the world that flow north. The Monongahela River was one that runs right through Morgantown, West Virginia. It's a huge, massive river. Did y'all hear about this bridge that collapsed the other day in Pittsburgh?
Yeah.
It's like maybe 100, well, maybe further, maybe it's like 200 yards from my aunt's house. And like, it's this bridge that we walk over all the time because like last year we went and ran a race in Pittsburgh. So we parked in my aunt's house, walked across the bridge, go to the park and run the race. It says so loud, like all of our neighbors heard it come crashing down. It's this huge ravine, right? Pittsburgh is famous for its rivers. Three rivers can come up. One of them is the Monongahela. It flows north. It's really strange. The Nile flows north because of the geography, right? It starts up in the mountains in the south and it runs north and then becomes a delta. We all understand deltas like down in Louisiana. Well, that delta area, like in Louisiana where the Mississippi ends, it brings all that soot and silt, but also nutrient rich, fertile soil. And this is where they're planted, kind of in the delta region where it's spreading out. Further south in Upper Egypt, in the south, right, it's going to be more high plains, there's going to be more deserts, there's going to be places, where it's more like what you imagine the pyramids of Giza. This is like the planting area. This is where people are like working in the fields, but there's also a place of mud, right? Like you think of South Louisiana, things that get flooded a lot where it gets really muddy and gross. So they don't have big stone structures down here. They have brick structures. When I stayed in Tanzania, everyone's living, I stayed in this little village for several weeks with an Anglican priest, and everyone lived in mud brick homes. And people were like making mud bricks, like right there. Like you make mud, you add straw, you put it in a little mold. It's like not utterly complicated. People are still doing it and living in it, and the bricks are strong. The area has no source of stone. And the thing with the mud, you make a mud structure, a mud house or mud temple in the Delta region, what happens when it floods? The mud returns to mud, right? It's one thing to make mud brick in the desert. It's another to make it. And so we don't have a lot of permanent structures from this time. While Ramses is famous for leaving a lot of historical stuff for us to go back and find, he doesn't leave a lot in this area. So it's really hard to excavate when things melted back into the earth. Physical evidence of slaves working there isn't likely to have survived. But a leather scroll dating to the time of Ramses II describes a close account of brick making, apparently by enslaved prisoners of war in Canaan and Syria. I guess one of the things is the Exodus is so significant, not just for the Jewish people, but for every single Christian. I said this last week, I'll say it again. The central aspect of our Eucharist, the breaking of the bread, the celebrating of the Last Supper, is a celebration of the Passover feast. Every Sunday, we're invoking the Exodus. Every single Sunday, Jesus Christ, who says, I am the new Passover. So it's central to our theology. So you want to say, if these people had this massive Exodus that transformed history for like 4,000 years, or at least 3,000 years, shouldn't there be some evidence of it? And Ramses II, who's like writing all over the place, where we have, we physically have him. Ramses II, we have his body. It's in the British Museum. Last night, Catherine, my daughter, and I watched Night in the Museum 2. Y'all familiar with this movie, comedy? It's in the British Museum. And there's Ramses II. Like the whole movie is like he comes back to life and he's like having this adventure through the night. But why don't they talk a lot about, why don't we see evidence of the Exodus? First of all, things are made out of mud. So whatever cities they built have dissolved. It's not like the pyramids of Giza. It's not even like the Temple Mount where you have these structures that we can look back to. There is a scroll they found that Ramses II talks about enslaving people from that Canaan, Syria area. Are these the Israelites who are being enslaved? It's hard to say. The scroll describes 40 taskmasters, each with a daily target of 2,000 bricks. So there is like a little bit of archaeological history.
What does BCE mean?
Before the Common Era.
Before the Common
So that's like before Jesus. So the tomb of Vizier Rekhmire it was in 1450 BCE, which would have been just around that time, but like a little bit, maybe around the time of Joseph, maybe a little bit earlier. Famously shows foreign slaves making bricks for the workshop storehouse of the temple of Amun-Ra in the building of Iran. They're labeled captures brought off by His Majesty to work in the temple of Amun. These are the Semites. That's the ethnic group of the Israelites. Israelites are Semitic people, and Nubian people. So people just north of Egypt, which would be in Canaan, and just south. So striking out bricks from molds, leaving them to dry and measuring their amounts under watchful eyes. And here it is. We have this picture from the vizier where he left image of like these Nubians and these Semite people making bricks, and like shows them like working and toiling away. Obviously, you see this, case closed, the Exodus happened, right? Not a ton of archaeology, but we have this. Almost no papyri. One of the innovations of the Egyptians is they developed papyrus, where you could write and record, and it was like wonderful. And they had these vast libraries. It's so amazing. And that was really amazing, especially further south in the dry conditions where those things could be preserved. We don't have a lot from the Delta region where papyrus would get wet and dissolve into nothingness and gook. They did find one though, from Anastasia VI, from around this time. So it's around the time between Joseph and before the Exodus. And it describes how the Egyptian authorities allowed Semitic nomads from Edom, and Edom is this region which is just kind of on the east banks of the Dead Sea. Y'all remember the Edomites are descendants of who? Esau. Nailed it. So Semitic nomads from Edom who worshiped Yahweh to pass the border fortress in their region and proceed with their livestock to the lakes of Pithom. So there is something that this group of people from Edom came down, they allowed them to pass through and settle in this region. Could that have been Joseph's and Joseph's family? Could that have been the descendants of Jacob? Maybe. Shortly after that, papyrus was written. They discovered one of those big old steles, one of those big old rocks that they carved on and they wrote a bunch of history on. And this is the first time where we see somebody mention the Israelites. This is the oldest form where it acknowledges a people of Israel, which is exciting when you're like talking about like, did this happen? Did this happen? Well, the reason why I'm going down this trail, just briefly, is I think there's like every reason for doubt. Every reason for doubt. Like Jesus says some bonkers stuff. Crazy thing has happened in the Old Testament. Like Elijah gets swept up in a whirlwind of fire. Like Jesus calls to a dead Lazarus. You say, is this person like really the Son of God? What he claims. There's every reason for doubt. I think people get lazier than that. They don't even ask those questions. They just say, I believe in science, so I don't believe in God. I believe in, I'm mathematical, so I don't believe in religion. It's so dismissive. But like there is this science of archaeology where it's like we can go back and actually find proof of things. Like Israelites existed. It's not this foreign concept. Like we can go back and say, here is evidence of Israelites living. Here is evidence that there was a person named Jesus. The question then becomes not whether there's no religion and nothing is true, is what Jesus said true? And that changes the conversation. So if we say, was there some Exodus experience? Were the Israelites in Egypt? And the whole theology that develops after that, is that true? And how does that make sense? And then we can discuss that theologically. Are y'all tracking with me? So it's exciting when you do discover things like the Egyptians writing about this new people of Israel. So this stele called the Merenthah stele bears the first mention of an entity called Israel in Canaan. So exciting. What does it possibly say? It says, now the princes are prostrate, saying peace. Okay. Hatti is pacified, meaning like the Hittites. The Canaan has plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon, which was a city, a Philistine city, has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Israel is laid to waste and seen not. Hey, they acknowledge Israel, right? Now, it's not the best circumstance. It's not like, super exciting. It didn't say like, in Israel, super cool country that we really respect and have a lot of admiration for. It's like, we have destroyed Israel completely. But it puts us on the map. So this is written around the time when the Israelites say they're in Egypt, enslaved, the Egyptians acknowledge this land, although it's kind of denigrating. So here's that amazing Mephistopheles stele. Oh, you can see it right there. Second from the left, little figure of a Semitic person being whipped. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you're helping Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king had told them to do. They let the boys live. King of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" Now there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot going on. So now we're back in Egypt. The people are being oppressed. He says there's too many. If they realize how many they are, they're going to rise up and overwhelm us, take over our country. They'll become, right, the new owners of Egypt. What is interesting right here in the story so far for you? What stands out?
Are they all slaves by now?
Yeah, they're all enslaved.
So you're killing off your manpower.
Killing off your manpower. Hey, I mean, it's kind of ironic where it's like everyone like renting their clothes, like, oh, Mexicans, immigrants are stealing our jobs. And then we have like a labor shortage,
Right.
like, and we have like a deficit in births. So it's like we have a shrinking population, a shrinking workforce. Oh, if there's only some group of people that could just easily walk across our southern border and fill those jobs. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine what that would be. Yeah, you're killing off your own workforce, so it's like shooting yourself in the foot.
It makes me funny that when China wanted to reduce its population, they, to one child, they wanted boys.
So that's it, right? China.
So
And so what happened was people started having illegal abortions or sending out their children to adoption centers. So you get rid of the girls. So a lot of little babies that have been adopted were little Chinese girls because parents didn't want that. That's right. That's right, Lou.
but that's the opposite. I mean, they would think that it, yeah, they want to reduce the population.
In part because every patriarchal society until our own, right? Every patriarchal society said like the power, the lineage, the inheritance comes through the men of our family. It's passed through men. But what is unique about Israel and the Jewish people? Who are the inheritors of the Israelite Semitic ethnicity? The women. It passes through the women. And so if you want to make an Israelite baby, the boys don't matter. It's the girls that matter. So in one sense, one thing that strikes me just wonderfully, and I think like the writers must have put this in because it's ironic. So we're going to kill the men because that's what we understand. We're going to keep the boys down. We'll keep the women and impregnate them and make little Egyptian babies. But that's not how it works. You keep the women babies and they're going to have little Jewish babies. Ha! Joke's on you, Pharaoh. Also, there's like a circularness to this. I don't think like the gospel writers, well, I think the Jewish writers are not intending this because they're not writing the New Testament. But I think the gospel writers are obviously hearkening back to this story in the birth story of Jesus, right? What does King Herod say? What does King Herod do? Right? Immediately after the birth of Jesus, we celebrate the murder of the innocents, where Herod says, kill all the boys. Go and kill all the boys because a boy is going to come up and challenge my throne. So there's like a circularness. So when the gospel writers are writing, they're saying, look back towards this, right? This is like there's a lot of plays, variations on the theme. It's kind of a foreshadowing in some ways. So God was kind to the midwives. The midwives didn't do it, right? The midwives said like, these are children of God. The midwives in the story are kind of like celebrated. So God was kind to the midwives and people increased and became even more numerous. Oh my gosh, too many children. The midwives feared God, he gave them their own families. The midwives see that there is a true God living with the people of Israel. Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born must be thrown into the Nile. Let every girl live. What else? Anything else before we move on from this story that strikes you?
One thing that strikes me is that the midwives are named, so many people in this are not named, but we know those names of those women.
We know these two names. Pua, I believe, means like beautiful one, and I forget the other woman's name, and I forget what Shifra means, but it's like something nice, like flower, something innocuous. It is interesting that it's named. The Bible, there's so much the Bible doesn't tell us. And so it's important when it does say something or go into a certain person. The fact that these two people are named is wonderful. The fact that it's going to be Hebrew women who are going to be saving the Israelite people, right? Maybe it is some foreshadowing or kind of looking back towards other people like Rahab, the prostitute who's going to be saving the Israelites, or even Ruth, who's like a Moabite woman who's going to be the great grandmother of King David. So the midwives let them live. Now a man, the tribe of Levi, married a Levite woman. What is unique about the Levites? They're not the priests yet, but they will be. Right at this point in history, the tribes of Israel don't mean a whole lot. They don't have any land, they don't have any significance, but they will. It will all be divided in the time of Moses. So Moses is going to start separating people out. God's going to tell Moses, call the Levites to be my priests. Set the Levites apart. Oh, how handy for God to say that to Moses, Levite. Just a little side note there. So Levite marries a Levite marries another Levite. So he's like pure Levite on both sides. Gives birth to a son. She saw there's a fine child. She hid him. You're not going to have my baby. But when she could hide him no longer, we all know the story, right? What does she do? Puts him in the basket, floats it down the river. Pharaoh's young daughter walks by. She does it just at the time when she knows Pharaoh's daughter is going to be down there bathing every day, and like she's going to see this baby. They planned it perfectly. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby? She said, yes, go. So she went. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So not only does she get to keep the baby, now she gets paid for the baby. So the woman took the baby, nursed him, and when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Moshe. Names are important. We're always talking about names in the Old Testament. Samuel. It comes from the word Shem, El, like to hear God. And what is it that Samuel says? Like, I hear you, God, like the one who listens to God. Moshe means to draw out. So she says, I will call you Moshe because I've drawn you out of the river. But like, again, it's like this play on words. Moshe is going to draw his people out of Egypt. So it's kind of not just saying where he's coming from, it's also telling the story in some ways of where he's going. We should all just learn Hebrew and it'd make so much more sense. But Moshe, the one who draws out. And that's going to be significant later on. Now Moses is grown. Okay, just in your mind's eye, like if we're just making a mental movie, you close your eyes, you see Moses, what is he going to learn to do being raised in Pharaoh's kingdom? Being raised as one of the princes of Egypt. What would that have entailed at the time? Would have had the best of everything. Would have been educated. He would have been raised to be a leader. Absolutely. In his education, what would that have included? If you can just imagine, a young prince of Egypt. Warfare, sure. Like you gotta learn how to fight. Super awesome. Learn how to prepare to be a military leader. What else would he have learned? To govern, how to order people in society, which is awesome because it's going to come in later. Sorry, my aunt's texting me. He's going to learn how to govern, which is going to be necessary as they're creating a new community. That's like the latter half of Exodus. He's also going to be learning about the Egyptian gods, right? He's going to be raised going to Egyptian temples. He's going to be raised like worshiping all the pantheon of gods. He will know intimately. I can't imagine any universe, even the lowest slaves are being raised up to honor the gods of Egypt. He will absolutely be wrapped up in all of this. So he goes out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and one of his own people. We talked about this last week, that one of the beautiful, wonderful, mysterious aspects of Judaism is they've always been able to somewhat be separated and stay ethnically unique. He sees the Semitic people being hurt. And he goes and he kills the Egyptian and he buries him in the sand. Why? Because it's probably no big deal for Moses, because Moses probably is walking around in armor. He probably has a sword on his belt. He's probably trained for war every day of his life since he went to Pharaoh's kingdom. So he sees someone abusing a Semite, he goes and kills him, cuts his head off, buries him in the desert. No problem. Let the desert claim its own. You know, the perfect murder. Well, then the next day he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? I had an Uncle Lenny who was from the Bronx. Maybe he was from Brooklyn. He was from New York. Uncle Lenny was a New York Italian. He'd married my Aunt Mimi. And he had one of those like scratchy voices. And he spoke just the way like a caricature would do it on The Sopranos. Which, by the way, here's a horrifying thought. This matters not, but I've been watching the Sopranos recently. And James Gandolfini, y'all familiar with like James Gandolfini, the actor? In season 1, he's a year younger, like him physically, he's a year younger than I am now, which very upsetting thought. So my Uncle Lenny, I remember one time we were fighting, he's like, hey kids, why are y'all fighting with each other? You're supposed to be fighting everybody else. Like, what's the matter with you? So I remember like life lessons from Uncle Lenny. He'd also like wrap up $5 and put it in the palm of his hand and give me like, slide me $5 every time I saw him. Take your mother out for a scoop of ice cream. Like, thanks, Uncle Lenny. So he sees two Hebrews and he pulls the Uncle Lenny. Hey, why are y'all fighting? You're supposed to gang up on everybody else. And like, who made you ruler over us, huh? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? What? They found out? Those rats, you know, this is terrifying news. If these Hebrews know that he killed somebody that was supposed to be the perfect murder, everybody knows. He gets terrified and he flees. What I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses had fled from Pharaoh and he went to live in Midian. He sat down by a well. Goes to Midian. He's like, I got to get the hell out of here. He goes as far as humanly possible. Now, where is Midian, you might ask? He's like, I'm going to go across the sea. I'm going to go through the desert. I'm going to travel as far as humanly possible that the Pharaoh can never find me. So up here, I'll point this down. We're in Lower Egypt. This is the Delta region. You see how like kind of the Nile spreads out veiny and it breaks off. And this is the really fertile area where they're going to harvest and plant. Civilization is born here. This is Ramses and Pithom. Earlier in the chapter, it said they go down and they settle in Ramses and Pithom. That's a really fertile place. That's where there's lots of mud. That's where they can do all these things. This is where they live. So he's going to cross over here. This is the Suez Canal, by the way. The Suez Canal, you remember when the Evergreen got stuck in the Suez Canal? That was awesome. We're still having like supply chain issues since then. So the Suez Canal just kind of cuts through into these lakes and builds here. You're going down here, you're crossing the Red Sea, all the way down past Mount Sinai. This is all desert, nothingness. So Moses walks past Mount Sinai, crosses the water again into the land of Midian. And you see the land of Edom just north of that. The Edomites are the descendants of who? Esau. You nailed it. So he goes down to Midian. This isn't like I ran away to Tuscaloosa. This is like I ran away to California. I went to Alaska, right? Then maybe you walk across the land bridge to Russia. It's like, I'm getting the hell out of Dodge as far as humanly possible. No one could possibly find me here. Goes to Midian. Now, a priest of Midian. Moses, who is a descendant of the tribe of Levi, who will be the priestly class. Says the priest of Midian has 7 daughters. Anytime you hear the word 7, anytime in the Bible, you got to stop and reflect. Why is 7 an important number to us? It's complete. It's the completion. It's a holy number. That like these things aren't happening by chance. Like this is one of those sacred holy numbers. 3, 4, 7, 10, 12. These are numbers that like are important in history. 7 days of creation. When they come to Jesus, how many times should I like forgive somebody? 7 times? It's like 7 times 77. Like it's the number 7, right? He has 7 daughters. So you know this guy's sacred. This guy's doing it. They came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds, some awful shepherds come and they drove them away, but Moses got up and came to the rescue and watered their flock, which is like no small thing. They have a whole flock of sheep. There's 7 women, and Moses, like powerful Moses, you see him like ripping his sleeves off his, his garments, and he's like watering the troughs. He does this amazing thing. This is also hearkening back. This is, look, this is poetry. It's all speaking to itself. What story does this remind us of? It should remind you of Rebecca and Isaac. When Isaac's servant goes to find somebody, right? She says, like the servant of Rebecca comes to the servant and says, I will water your camels. Like do this huge, arduous thing. So that's what Moses does. It's all part of the story. He waters their flock, and the girls returned to Reuel, their father. He asked them, why have you returned so early? It should take you longer. This is a hard job. It takes a long time. They answered, an Egyptian. Oh, they don't say an Israelite. They say an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water from us and watered the flock. And where is he? What the hell's the matter with you? Bring it. You met a man. You met a man and he was bold and strong and courageous and you didn't bring him home. Go fetch the man. So they invite him in to eat. Moses agreed to stay with the man. And as a party gift, he gives him a daughter. He's like, hey, just take Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gives birth to a son. They're kind of advancing the narrative fairly quickly. Like they go and have supper. They marry his daughter, and the next day he has a baby. And Moses names him Gershom, saying, I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. He's recognized and called an Egyptian. Isn't that something interesting? Even though he's there because he killed an Egyptian. He's there, in fact, because he's so Israelite that he killed the Egyptian and he can't live amongst the Egyptians. So he goes and he stays in Midian.
Did Moses know at this point that he was an Israelite? Because he was raised by
Oh yeah.
Pharaoh's
Oh yeah.
daughter.
Moses knows. Moses knows because when he kills the Egyptian, he says, they're abusing my people. He saw an Egyptian abusing his people, the Hebrew people. And so that's why he kills the Egyptian out of clansmanship. So Moses knows, he knows what's up. But Moses is making a new life for himself. Phase 2. You know what? Midian's not so bad. A whole new world, whole new people. Going to live out my days. I'm just going to be a shepherd. The prince of Egypt, living off the land. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. So he's there. Not a short period, long period. Long enough to grow his beard, get wild hair. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Man, this is the story. You're going to hear this 1,000 times in the Old Testament. The covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. Now let's go back. Look, I know I repeat myself all the time. And I'm just going to, but I repeat myself all the time to my kids. I tell Catherine sometimes, like, look, I'm only going to tell you 17 to 18 more times to put your socks on, right? But when you're learning some stories like this, they're so important. We have to repeat it. When Moses has the vision, when he falls asleep, what is it that God is saying in the covenant? What's profound about this covenant God is making? He falls asleep and he sees animals cut in two, and he sees a torch of fire and of smoke, incense passing between the two. In ancient Israel, you and I, Deborah and I were living off the land together. We share a fence. There's no real fence because we're like nomadic people and like we don't build fences. But like we say, like, this is my land, that's your land. But we got to watch out for each other. We got to protect each other's sheep from, raiders and robbers and thieves. We got to protect each other's sheep from wolves. And sometimes our sheep are going to get mixed up. And we got to separate them honestly. So we make a pact. What we do is we're going to cut a sheep. And we're going to have half the sheep over here, half the sheep over there, and we're going to stand between them. We're going to spit on our hands and shake hands and say, look, if either of us violate this pact to protect and care for one another, then may we be torn apart. May we be cut in half, just like this sheep. That's the covenant. Moses falls asleep where he's fully rendered unconscious. Moses can't do anything. He's like frozen there. And he sees this covenant being made. And God is saying, see, I am making this covenant with you, but I'm doing everything. Moses doesn't meet God in the middle. They don't have this mutuality. He says, Moses, I'm going to make you abundant if you do this. If you proselytize, if you make converts, if you build a temple, if you glorify my Moses, he says, Abraham, I'm making a covenant with you. And you're doing nothing. And the symbolism is God saying, and may I be utterly destroyed if I fail in my covenant to you. He said, I'm making a promise that you will have children, you will have an inheritance. For what? Not just for your glory, but to glorify my name. And my name will be glorified because you didn't do anything. You didn't help in any way. So God takes all the action and all the burden on God's self. Now, this is the moment. God hears the cry of the poor. He says, I remember my covenant. And we're going to hear this 1,000 more times in the Old Testament because the people are going to walk away from God. The people are going to go, don't just sin boldly, sin notoriously, sin aggressively, sin as much as you can. They're going to run away from God every chance they get. And then they're going to groan and cry out to God. And he'll say, and God hears their cry and remembers the covenant he made. We talk about faith. We talk about, we are people of faith. No, we're miserable sinners. We're lousy at faith. The story of the Old Testament is that we're not called to be faithful. The story is that God is faithful to us. God is faithful to us. It's a story about God's faithfulness. When Jesus dies on the cross, saying he is being faithful in his sacrifice when we are not. So God hears the cry of the poor. And this, again, is something profound. I'm talking to somebody the other day about prayer. Like, does God respond to our prayers? Does it feel like God? It doesn't feel like God responds to our prayers. And maybe that's a question of what is prayer? What is the purpose of prayer? Sometimes we view prayer as us asking God for things and God either doing it or not doing it. And maybe that's a limited understanding of prayer. Maybe that's some small aspect. If you say prayer is conversation, prayer is dialogue, prayer is praise, prayer is thanksgiving and gratitude and all this. But sometimes, somebody gets sick. My auntie gets sick and I pray, oh, please make her better. And she doesn't, she dies. Does that mean there's no God? Not exactly. It's like that maybe that's not exactly how prayer works, or maybe not how God responds all the time. Although God sometimes does do miracles. Although sometimes people have miraculous recoveries. I don't know. How come God didn't race down and save every person from dying from coronavirus? I don't know. Maybe God is part of the wisdom working through the science community that can develop a vaccine in record time. And that like part of God's salvation is coming through the vaccine. I don't know. The story isn't that God doesn't respond to our prayers. It's that God does hear and interface and interact with us. God hears the cry of his people and he comes down. Now, how come there are people who suffer in different areas of the world? How come there were slaves in America who suffered for hundreds of years, right? It's like there's some things that are just mysterious and we don't know why God isn't racing down to heal every person. God doesn't necessarily work like that, but God does respond. But God is not completely aloof, that God is not so removed that he's never part of the story and that he wants to be engaged in our lives. So he hears the cry of his people who'd been suffering for 300 years, and he responds. It's part of this covenant. Why does he respond? Because God made this promise. I will make you abundant. Moses, tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. What? Now, where exactly did Moses go? We're not sure. This is St. Catherine's, where they built a church. Every place in the Bible, somebody's founded a church. Like, oh, this must be Mount Horeb. Now, there's only two mountains we ever have to talk about, Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. So we're calling it Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is Mount Zion, right? Or Mount Sinai. Horeb, we don't know exactly where it is. We're not exactly sure. Is it this mountain right here? Is it that mountain right beside it? Is it like the cleft between? We're not exactly sure because it's a long time ago. And, things wear out. But he goes from Midian over to Mount Sinai, what they're calling Mount Horeb. Some people suggest maybe it was two different mountains, like they're right beside each other. There's like a little gap between them. Or maybe it's all Mount Sinai or it's all Mount Horeb. We don't know. He goes to Mount Sinai. What else is going to happen on Mount Sinai? This is where he gets the Ten Commandments. So it's where he comes back with the people after they flee from Egypt. So you got to keep these things in mind. So he's out there on Mount Sinai, the most holy of holy mountains. He doesn't know it yet. He's tending the flock of his people. He's on the far side. And he saw that there was a bush on fire and it did not burn up. So he said, I will go over and see the strange sight. Why is this bush not burning up? Let's see. It's desert. You know, have y'all been to the desert before? Tell them, what kinds of deserts have you been to? You been to Egypt? Okay. Egyptian desert. California, Israel, yeah. Arizona. California, you know, sometimes I think of the desert, I think of like the sand dunes of like the Sahara Desert or something. This is like the rock desert, not sandy desert. There's like nothingness. You're bone dry. And so he goes out and he sees this bush that in just this environment, if it's on fire, it should just be consumed. And it doesn't. Fire is one of these other powerful images in the Old Testament. Name all the times we experience God in fire. And just, well, you can say Old Testament, New Testament. Where do we see fire? Pillar of flame, leading the people out of Egypt. Elijah, he sees the whirlwind, he sees him in a fire. Yeah. Elisha also is also going to be taken up in a whirlwind of fire, taken up in the chariots of fire. It's super, very dramatic. Where else do we see fire in the Old Testament? Pentecost. The Holy Spirit descends like tons of fire, right? Fire is one of these powerful images. It's like this elemental image, right? It's elemental, like fire. I mean, you get like a group of people to stand around a bonfire. What's everybody doing? Like staring into the fires, like we're drawn into. There's something profound. There's something amazing. There's something powerful about fire. I think of even let there be light. When I was at seminary, we had this beautiful chapel that was built in 1823. It was built just, you know, not far from the Potomac River, before Alexandria was a city, before Washington, D.C. was a city, 1823. They found the seminary, they built this chapel. It was a chapel for Robert E. Lee would go to this chapel. Francis Scott Key helped provide the funds to build the chapels. Like, you know, Gerald Ford would walk past the chapel on his way to work as president of the United States. This chapel is just like so much history. Well, we also had, it was like St. Thomas, where it's a kind of a low chapel where we didn't have a lot of like ornamentation, a lot of incense. But one week we had a chapel team that said, we're going to have big church, high church. They were real excited. They had incense and they went, it was like noonday prayer. They had big thing. After the church service, they took out the charcoal, they put it in the sink, put water on top of it, broke it up a little bit, put more water on top of it, wrapped it up in paper towel, threw it in the trash, went to lunch. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm staying in class, in Hebrew class, and I'm seeing all these fire trucks racing through the seminary. So I run out, I tell everybody, I'm like, I'll go look and see what's happening. And the whole chapel's on fire. The roof is just like this enormous, I mean, it's like 200-year-old pine that's just like been waiting for a spark, right? That charcoal had caught the paper on fire, caught the trash can on fire, it went straight up the wall, hit the ceiling, and just nowhere to go. It was this act of God. I run in, tell everybody in my class, I run over to the library to get Katie. Katie has like a stack of like 20 books. I'm like, Katie, you got to come outside. The chapel's on fire. She's like, no, I'm checking out books. It's like, no, Katie, leave the books. Chapel's on fire. We got to go. Now, we've already been married for about a year. So she's like, no, Josiah, I'm checking out the books. Fine. So we're like, check out like 20 books, slowly, painfully. We like walk out. I'm like carrying all these books for her. And she's like, oh my God, the chapel's on fire. I was like, yeah. to witness a fire like that, I mean, it's an act of God. I mean, it just is overwhelming. He sees this fire, and God calls to him, Moshe, Moshe. He says, Hanani, here I am. Now this word, these are like magic words in Hebrew. He says, here I am. It's a word that's going to resonate through time and space, through the Hebrew scriptures. From Isaiah, I hear the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? He said, here I am, Hanani. What makes Hanani such a powerful statement? It is an offer of complete availability, of total readiness to serve. When we utter Hanani, we make ourselves fully available. So it's like what a servant would say. It's like what a slave would say to the master. Say, where are you? Say, Hanani, like I'm offering you all of myself. Like I am here before you. It's what Samuel is going to say. It's what Abraham says when God calls to Abram, makes him Abraham. When God calls to Samuel, and he says, Hanani, here I am. So Moses has this statement of faith, this really beautiful, full offering. He sees this amazing thing happening. He hears a voice, Moshe, Moshe. He says, Hanani, I don't know what the hell's going on, but I'm here. I'm here for it. I'm here for you. He says, do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. He said, I am the God of your father. What did he just say? God heard the cry of his people. He says, I will remember the covenant I made to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. And God repeats that. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. At this, Moses hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. What's funny, Moses hides his face because he's afraid. Now, this word afraid, we see this word in Hebrew a lot, fear, but it's also the same Hebrew word for to revere, right? It's something of respect. It's not necessarily be afraid of God. Oh, God's going to get you. It's saying have reverence. So he's not necessarily, I don't think Moses is scared in the sense of like demons are, the pits of hell have opened, the demons are coming out. He's just in utter reverence for the presence of God. He hides his face. What's ironic is later in the story, Moses is going to say, can I see you? I want to see you face to face. When he goes to Mount Sinai, he asks to see God's face. So God puts him in the cleft. God puts his hand on him and passes by and says, and it just sees the passing of God's glory because Moses can't stand, no human can see the face of God, right? It's just too much. So he hides his face this time because he's afraid to see God's face. And later he's unable to see God's face. I know I've told you this story before, but if you go to the Sistine Chapel, right, wow, like God giving the divine spark to man, like right in the middle, it's the story of Abraham or God making Adam. It's like beautiful. That's the story. Right beside it, like a foot to the right, in the Sistine Chapel, the most famous chapel of all chapels, painted by Michelangelo in great detail. You see this image of God's glory passing Moses. And you see like God coming. Lou gave me a great card about a woman. It's kind of like this, but it's like God's coming, God is, and God's passing. There's three images. Well, God in Michelangelo's interpretation is wearing have you been to Sistine Chapel, Lou? Have you seen this image? God is wearing like a surgical gown, that doesn't have a back. So his gown is just open in the back. He's not wearing panties. So you see God coming, like these flowing beards and robes, God's present, God's flowing robes and beard. And then you see God passing and the back of his robes are open. And you see God's hiney, just in the Sistine Chapel is God in his fullness, right there, the glory of God. Moses, after he sees the passing of God on Mount Sinai, right? And he's getting the things, he wears a veil. Why does he wear a veil? He puts a veil over his face because his face is shining, because his face is glowing and it's radiating. And it's people are going to freak out if they see my face. I'm going to cover it because I want people to not be afraid. Well, just a funny historical side note. I feel like I've been just wandering down tangents all day, but this funny historical side note is in the Latin Vulgate translation. The thing about it is we're not getting more diluted versions of the Bible every time we have a new copy or a new interpretation. We're getting better, truer interpretations of the Bible. In the Vulgate Latin, they'd confused the word for to shine with horns. And so you see a lot of like Renaissance images of Moses and a lot of sculptures of Moses with horns. Because Moses came down from the glory of God, saw the presence of God, put on a veil because he had horns. What? You must have thought like the people reading that and interpreting that, they're like, yeah, it's real weird, but that's what it says. Like that is Holy Scripture, the word of the Lord. Makes no sense, but saw the face of God and then had horns. Like, so later on, as they got better at translations, they corrected that. I have seen the misery of my people. I have heard them crying out because of the slave drivers, and I'm concerned. I've seen their suffering, and I'm concerned. I've come to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, here's the caveat. This is like the second part of the sentence. I've come to take you to good land, the land of milk and honey, the land that's already filled with other people, land that's currently occupied, and God says it, by the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites, the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, the people who are there. It's kind of like the conquest, the divine conquest, manifest destiny, pushing westward, right? Land, endless land of milk and honey, except for the people who've been here for 10,000 years, except for the native people, but who cares about them? I mean, even this land we're on now was land previously occupied. It wasn't until it was pretty late into the 1800s when there were still Native Americans in Birmingham. The area I live in, Shades Cahaba, we have all these Native American words, Cahaba, all these Native American words describing all of our land areas where Native American people live. The area I live in Homewood, Shades Cahaba, was a ceremonial area. Lakeshore was a ceremonial site for Native American groups, where I guess because it's kind of in the valley, if you all been to Lakeshore, there's like the Lakeshore River that runs through it. It's like a creek now, but it's heavily wooded, beautiful, shady, not great for hunting, great for partying, great for relaxing in the heat of Alabama. People lived mostly in Birmingham, where it's wide, open, flat, safer. People lived in Vestavia and into Hoover, where it's probably better for hunting grounds. But Homewood was a place for rest and relaxation. The problem that people are going to have primarily with the Old Testament, where people are going to say, oh, God is so violent and God is so ugly, is there is violence. They go into a land that is occupied. It continues to be an issue. It continues to be like the geopolitical issue of the Middle East. Deborah, when we went to Israel, did you go and hear the debate between the Jewish man and the Palestinian man? They're debating about why they should each have the land. There's a presentation about it. It's still a big argument where the Palestinians are saying, okay, we get that the Jewish people are oppressed, but we're oppressed because we're living here for 2,000 years, and you come in and take our land and kill us, which doesn't seem super awesome. You see where the land is slowly getting eaten away, and you have these strange things like Bethlehem. Bethlehem is a Palestinian community, so it's surrounded. But to get to other Palestinian communities, you're not allowed to leave. Like if you're Palestinian, you're born in Bethlehem, you can't just leave and go to Jerusalem 10 miles north. You can go to other places in Palestine, but like there are these narrow corridors, like maybe a road that connects, to Samaria or connects to other places along the West Bank. And it's not easy to access. So you can't fly out of, Jerusalem, let's say. You can't fly out of Tel Aviv. You can't fly out of places that are easy to access. So it might take you a day and a half to just get to Lebanon, where you can go into Lebanon and fly out of the Lebanese airport. It's like a humanitarian crisis. It's terrible and people are suffering vastly. But it's something we should all talk about more. So next week, we're going to continue. The best thing you can do is go home and read Exodus. I encourage you to read at least the first 5 chapters. We're going to stop here for today. But what questions do you have? What thoughts do you have? All right. Exciting. All right. Well, everybody, thank you. Go and read Exodus. Come back next week and we'll pick up with the Exodus.